Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Wie bist du, Seele, in mir sogar betrübt, which translates to How sad you are, my soul. All in all, relatively straightforward chorale. We do have some interesting harmonic quirks going on here in like the hot spot. This is typically where in like your standard length chorale that's usually two systems, the interesting stuff happens. There is a bit of a typo here. This A sharp didn't make it into the chorale, but I wrote it in there after the fact and we should be good to go. But with all that being said, we're just going to hop right into the analysis. We have one sharp in the key signature. We start on E minor and we end on E major. So I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is E minor, passing tones in the lower voices, and a neighbor tone here in the alto, which leaves us with B7 over F sharp, A, D sharp, and B, which is our 5 chord in second inversion with the 7th. And then we get E minor in first inversion, G, B, E, and B. This 5-4-3 chord is like a substitute for 7-6, which is typically what we would expect here, but because we have a B in it, turns it into a 5-7 chord. E is a chord tone, B is a chord tone, so we don't have to mark those. And then we get G, E, C sharp, and A, which is A7 over G. That's 4-4-2. We have some melodic minor going on in the alto, and the 4 chord becomes major, or in this case, it becomes a dominant 7 chord when you harmonize it with that raised 6th scale degree. Then we have some non-chord tones on the end of the beat. D sharp is a non-chord tone, A is a chord tone, so we don't have to mark it, and F sharp is a non-chord tone, so the aggregate of that leaves us with D sharp diminished over F sharp, which is 7-6. And then we go to E minor, E, B, E, and G, which is our tonic triad and root position. Passing tone in the bass and neighbor tone in the alto, which actually leaves us with G major 7 over F sharp, which is 3-4-3. I don't really think it makes too much of an impact on the harmony, but I've been analyzing these passing chords that are a third apart from the chord on the harmonic rhythm recently, so I'm going to keep doing that for the sake of consistency. Then we get E minor in first inversion, G, B, E, and G, 1-6. E right here is a chord tone, but it briefly takes the chord and puts it in root position. And our half cadence ends with 5, B, B, D sharp, and F sharp with this 4-3 suspension over the bass. 4-3 suspensions are very common in Bach's chorales. In cadences, you can see 4-3 suspensions over tonic triads too, but 4-3 suspensions are common within the phrase as well when we're talking about 5 chords. So moving on to the next phrase, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of E minor, so no modulations just yet. We start off with E minor, E, B, E, and G, tonic triad root position. Then we get F sharp, B, D sharp, and A. I think we have a bit of a we have a 7-6 suspension over the bass here, and this A by association is a non-chord tone. Oh, actually, it is a chord tone. It feels like a non-chord tone, but it is a chord tone because this is a B7 chord over F sharp, another 5-4-3 chord like we saw earlier. And in fact, I think the chord is basically spelled the same with F sharp, A, D sharp, and A, except for we don't have a B in the melody, we have an A in the melody. But this B and this A, I guess you could technically analyze this as 7-6 as well, but with the counterpoint going on, it's kind of difficult to say. You definitely would expect a 7-6 chord more often in this situation than a 5-4-3 chord, but because we have reason to believe that this is a 5-4-3 chord because of what we saw earlier, I'm going to say it's a 5-4-3 chord. But either analysis is accurate because they're both functioning the same way and their pitch content is so similar to one another. But afterwards we get E minor again, G, B, E, and G. It's 1-6, and E takes the chord and briefly puts it in root position. We then get A sharp, C sharp, E, and F sharp, which is F sharp 7 over A sharp, which is 5-6-5 of 5. It's our dominant of our dominant, which is B. F sharp is a chord tone, so we don't have to mark it. And then we get the resolution of this secondary dominant, B major, B, B, D sharp, and F sharp, passing 7th in the tenor, and the phrase ends with E minor, E, G, B, and E. Next phrase takes us to the key of G major for a bit. We end in a half cadence. We start the phrase off in the key of E minor, though. We start off with B, B, D sharp from earlier in the phrase, and F sharp, which is our 5 chord, and then we get E minor again. E, B, E, and G. Tonic triad, root position. I think this is our gateway to the key of G major. It's now our 6 chord. Little neighbor tone here in the tenor before we get F sharp, B, D, and A, which is our 3 chord in second inversion. It's basically like the B7 chord that we've seen, but without D sharp. We have D natural, so this would be a 3-4-3 chord here. So we have some transitive harmony going on here. 6 typically is arrived at from 3, not the other way around. When we do see 3 and 6 in close proximity to one another, but Bach takes that even one step further by continuing that reverse direction cycle of falling fifths, I guess the cycle of raising fifths, and leaves us with F sharp, A, C, and A, which is F sharp diminished in root position here on the end of the beat. So typically we would expect the retrograde of the progression 7-3-6, because the cycle of falling fifths takes us to the tonic of the scale by fifths, but here we're arriving at a dominant functioning chord going up a fifth, which is kind of interesting. So 3 going to 7. This isn't a foreign chord progression by any means, but it's definitely less common than 4 going to 7. So it's kind of cool that Bach continues the cycle in this direction. And then we get G major, G, G, B, and B, 2 roots and 2/3 spelling. D is a chord tone, fills out the chord, and B is a chord tone, so we don't have to mark either of those. We get G major again, G, D, G, and B. No need to reanalyze. And then this B here briefly takes the chord and puts it in first inversion. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral there either. And then we get D major, D, D, F sharp, and A, which is our 5 chord root position. Next phrase takes us to the, doesn't take us anywhere actually. We end with the perfect authentic cadence. We're still in the key of G major here. Phrase starts off with another quasi, what's it called? Transitive progression. I've been calling them transitive progressions because from a voice leading perspective, if 3 can go to 6, 6 should be able to go to 3 via the voice leading, because they're next to each other, the same voice leading, just in an opposite direction, the retrograde, right? So 2 typically wants to go to 5, but here we see 5 going to 2. But granted, it's not quite as transitive as this progression here, due to the fact that this is basically a new phrase. A, C, E, and A, which is A minor in root position. That's our 2 chord. Passing tones in the lower voices give us another 3rd space progression, kind of like this one here. We have G, B, E, and oh no, I'm sorry. This is a C, not an A. This is C major 7 over G, another 4-3 chord, which is kind of interesting. The fact that those are popping up with some regularity in this, or more than just some, quite a bit of regularity in this chorale is kind of interesting. But yeah, 2 going to 4. I don't really think it makes a huge impact on the progression because the chords are so similar to one another. But yeah, 2 going to this passing 4 chord, maybe those are just passing tones, who knows. We would expect this to go to some type of dominant though. We have F sharp, A, D, and C. It's exactly where it goes. D7 over F sharp, which is 5-6-5. F sharp is a chord tone. D is a chord tone. We don't have to mark either of those. And then we get G major, G, G, D, and B. Tonic triad root position. This B here is also a chord tone that takes the chord and briefly puts it in first inversion. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral. And then we get another A minor chord here in proximity to our cadence. We have C, G, E, and A. A minor 7 over C, which is 2-6-5. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential situations. A is a chord tone, so we don't have to mark it. We typically would expect a 5 chord after this, which is what we get D, F sharp, D, and A. Passing 7th in the alto, and then we get G major, G, G, B, and G. 3 roots, 1/3 spelling. So 2-5-1 progression, very straightforward at the end of the phrase. One of the most bread and butter cadences that we'll find in Bach's writing. Next phrase, we see a half cadence at the end of it in the key of G major. And there's maybe even an argument that we briefly move to the key of D major here, but with C naturals in the bass clef and in the other voices as well, I think we're still in the key of G major, and this C natural is just a chromatic neighbor tone. But yeah, let's talk about it. We have D major at the beginning of the phrase here. We have D, F sharp, D, and A, which is our 5 chord. Passing tones in the lower voices, which doesn't give us an analyzable chord this time, so we won't mark anything. We then get F sharp, A, D, and A, which just takes the chord and puts it in first inversion. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral. We could just change the figured bass. A little neighbor tone here, and also a chromatic neighbor tone here in the alto, which leaves us with G, A, C sharp, and A. It's kind of like a secondary dominant going on here, and you know what? This is a circumstance in which I'm going to analyze it as 5-4-2 of 5, just because the fact that this C sharp is not diatonic to the key of G major, and I feel like it needs a bit more justification than just marking it as a neighbor tone. So I think that this chord, despite being incomplete, is still a chord that is in need of analysis. And then we get D major in first inversion afterwards, which is what we would expect a 5-4-2 chord to resolve to. F sharp, A, D, and A. 5-6. We have some passing tones in the alto and the bass before we get D, D, F sharp, and A. Still a 5 chord, just in root position. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral. Neighbor tone in the bass. Another D major chord here. D, A, D, and F sharp. No need to reanalyze. Passing 7th in the bass. And then we get our tonic G major. B, B, D, and G. 1-6. We have a neighbor tone in the bass, passing tone in the alto, which leaves us actually with C, E, G, and B, which is C major 7. That's a 4-7 chord. And then we get A, C, F sharp, and A, which is F sharp diminished over A. That B is an accent and non-chord tone. That's 7-6. 4 going to 7 is a very common chord progression in Bach. Just like how many of the chord progressions in Bach consist of a predominant, a dominant, and a tonic at the end of the progression. G, D, G, and B. There's our tonic. Passing tone in the bass, and then we get our tonic again in first inversion. B, G, D, and B. Another passing tone in the bass, and then we get another 4-3 suspension over our dominant here in this half cadence. D, F sharp, D, and A. D major in root position. And then the last phrase has the most interesting harmonic content, and that's by virtue of the fact that there is a chromatic or somewhat of a chromatic bass line going on here. There's no E sharp going on here. So we have D, D sharp, and E, which is like a quasi a chromatic bass line because it's separated by the end of a phrase and sort of aligns with the next phrase, but we do get a chromatic bass line here from F sharp until B, which is pretty cool, and we do eventually go back to the key of E minor. And it's interesting that E minor gets tonicized at the beginning of the phrase, but I don't quite hear it as a move back to the key of E minor just yet. So we have D sharp, B, F sharp, and F sharp, which is 5-6 of 6 in the key of G major, passing 7th in the tenor, and then we get E, G, B, and G, which is our 6th chord, E minor in root position. E is a chord tone, so we don't have to mark it. And then we get F sharp, D, D, and A, which is 5-6. We see this progression quite a bit in Bach, 6-5-6-1. But 1 isn't exactly 1 because you might notice this F natural here, which is probably the most interesting part of the chorale. So we have a passing 7th going on here in the alto, and then we get G, D, B, and B, which is more than just our tonic. I think this F natural here is implying the fact that it wants to resolve down to E, which means that G is probably operating as a secondary dominant here as 5 of 4. It's not uncommon for Bach to take a 5-1 progression and substitute 5 of 4 for 1 because they're based on the same triad, and it creates, you know, harmonic interest where that F natural is a pull down to E, which is the 7th of the 1 chord that wants to resolve to the 3 of the 4 chord, like the cycle that I learned pretty early in my jazz education, this idea that 7s and 3s sort of trade between one another in the working down the scale. Regardless, this progression is really interesting because I think the real trajectory is this A chord here. We have a secondary deceptive progression here as the big picture. We have, I'm going to skip this chord for a second, we have A, C, E, and A, which is our 2 chord, and 5 of 4 going to 2 is the same thing as 5 going to 6 in the key of the subdominant. So it's just in a roundabout way the deceptive progression for that key, just in secondary terms. But afterwards, this F natural here is our chordal 7th, but it's a non-chord tone in this context. It just gives us some additional cluing in regards to where the chord's most likely going to go. But before we get our 2 chord, which, like I said, is the big picture here, we get E major, G sharp, E, E, and B, which is another secondary dominant. It's 5, 6 of 2. One could even make the argument that if we were in the key of A minor here, we would have 7, 5, 6, 1, which is not an uncommon chord progression by any means. You could even say that the chord progression starts as early as this D major chord here, but I think really what's going on here is that we're still in the key of G major and we haven't really modulated just yet. It's this F natural here that creates kind of some interesting intrigue regarding where the trajectory of the harmony is. But I think really we're still in the key of G major here, and this E major chord is just an intermediary chord. It's a passing chord, literally passing between G and A. But I do think A minor is the point at which we move back to the key of E minor. It's now our 4 chord. This neighboring D sharp sort of hints at that. And then we get A sharp, C sharp, E, and G, which is A sharp fully diminished 7th in root position, which would be 7, 7 of 5, because A sharp's the leading tone to B, and B is our 5 in the key of E minor. But you could also analyze this as 5, 6, 5 of 5 as well. If you look at this F sharp as the root of the chord, Bach often takes 7, 7 and 5, 6 and plays with them in terms of which chord is which by that passing tone, because they're all just separated by a half step. Whether this is the 7th or the root of the chord, it's entirely up to you, and it's just based on your relationship with the harmony. Both are accurate analyses, but we would expect this to resolve to some semblance of a 5 chord, which it does. It is a semblance of a 5 chord. We have B, B, E natural, and F sharp. Here is a 4/3 suspension over a 5 chord, not at the cadence, which is, it's quite common to see these types of suspensions in Bach's chord progressions, but we get the resolution on the next beat with B, B, D sharp, and F sharp. We have a bit of a delayed passing 7th here in the tenor before we cadence on E major, E, G sharp, B, and E, which is our tonic triad with the Picardy third. Bach often ends his minor chorales with the Picardy third. And that is today's analysis. Really, I think the big takeaways here don't really reveal themselves until the end of the chorale, and I know that it's sort of fresh because if you've watched the video to the end, you know that I just talked about that. But the chromatic bass line is something that I've been keeping track of for my own records. The fact that there's a secondary deceptive progression going on, that's pretty interesting as well. And we also have the tonic operating as 5 of 4, and it's even more interesting because we don't see the tonic get used before we see 5 of 4. Usually, or I don't want to say usually, actually, a lot of the times we see 5 go to 1 and then 1 turn into 5 of 4, but here we just see 5 going to 5 of 4, which is combining the 1 and the 5 of 4 and just, or I guess technically just removing the 1 and just treating 5 of 4 like the tonic and aligning the two ideas together. But other than that, I think that's all I really wanted to talk about in today's video, so I'm going to cap the video off on those thoughts. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon and like the video if you enjoyed the content as well. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.